So again, welcome to our third energy code presentation. We're focusing on existing buildings and alterations today. This is the team of primary presenters today with Eric Vandermeer, Principal Chief of Engineering, Andy Burnham, Associate Principal and Manager of our Energy Services, and Nathan Miller, our Lead and Energy Analyst, myself as well, Emily Crosco. Let's go to the next slide. As most of you know, we are your integrative consultants, your experts in our 7 studios: mechanical, electrical, plumbing, lighting, energy, sustainability, and commissioning. Any follow-ups to this webinar, we'd love to hear from you, hear about the projects you're working on. Next slide. All right, and I'm gonna, first things first, hand that off to Eric to talk about. Thanks.
Thanks, Emily. So I know we hit on this last week, but just want to reiterate that all the Washington state codes have been delayed by 120 days via emergency rule. So they were scheduled to go in effect July 1st. That has now been delayed till the end of October. The state building code council made a very specific motion to go back into an off-cycle rulemaking process to revisit the energy code provisions for both the commercial and residential building energy code sections, to reduce the risk related to the Berkeley decision and EPCA adjacent items. So that process is underway. They have now, as of last Friday, received 28 code proposals on different ways that the code could be amended to mitigate this risk. And the first energy code tag meeting is scheduled for a week from today, next Wednesday, June 21st. So that is scheduled to be a meeting, pretty much an all-day energy code tag meeting. From 8:30 a.m. to 10:30 a.m. There's a joint meeting that they're going to be discussing kind of the rules of the road and what are the EPCA requirements. EPCA stands for the Energy Policy and Conservation Act, which was started around 1975 and has been amended by the federal government over the years. And then after that kind of introduction into the rules of the road and how they're going to look specifically at the residential tag proposals and at the commercial tag proposals. So just a lot still going on in development of the code. Seattle has also mentioned that they're going to be looking at where the state lands, and Seattle's legal counsel has also been looking into this Ninth Circuit Court Berkeley decision and the impacts of that. So high level update there. Let's keep moving on.
And this is where we put in our giant disclaimer that there is just a lot in flux right now. So everything here is kind of as of best information that we know today, but we're obviously in a really fairly exciting time with lots of moving parts and pieces.
I see a question of tag. What is a tag? Tag is so the State Building Code Council consists of the council itself, and they have committees that consist of the council members, and then there are technical advisory groups, tags, which are chaired by a council member and have various stakeholders from different special interest groups involved. So the energy code, there's 2 separate energy code tags, one for the residential buildings, one for the commercial buildings, that consists of 20 to 25 people. Those meetings are all open to the public. Those proposals are available on the State Building Code website for review. So yeah, it's an open, transparent public process that anybody can participate in or listen to recordings of or whatnot. So
awesome. Thanks, Eric. All right, quick recap on what we're going to go through today. We're trying to cram way less into this week's session than the last two that we've done, but we've still got, I don't know, 4 separate 1-hour presentations packed in here instead of the 10 that we've been doing on the previous sessions. So still a lot to get through, but hopefully a little slower pace than the previous ones, and we will hopefully have some time to kind of respond to questions in the moment as we go through. So do continue to use that Q&A. We'll try to address those in real time as best we can. Otherwise, some stuff might get put in the parking lot for the end of the meeting. High level, we're going to start with existing building types of modifications, how that's different between Washington and Seattle, summary of kind of what those are, talk through some of the key areas of flexibility for doing alterations, and then we're going to talk through some of the ongoing building performance things going on. So with that, we're going to dive right in. We're going to start with just a little bit of context on what's driving these code changes. I'm sure you've all seen this in previous sessions. Eric, want to give us just the quick run through?
Yeah, so we have very aggressive state mandates through the legislature, 70% reduction in net annual energy consumption of buildings, build zero fossil fuel greenhouse gas emissions, homes and buildings. And, you know, we can kind of take into account the overall cost. And as you know, our energy code is pretty much broken into new construction and then existing buildings. And most of the existing building sections are triggered when you're doing alterations and repairs. So we're going to dive kind of deep into that. But this code cycle at the state, we saw a lot more interest in the existing buildings. There was a lot more code proposals that were addressed towards the code provisions here. There was provisions that are trying to, you know, push forward what you do in existing buildings, whether you're touching things or not. And a lot of those proposals didn't make it through, but some of them did. And so we'll be talking about some of those major changes here. And then jumping to Seattle, and what we want to highlight here with existing buildings is, you know, resolution 3131-2, I guess, I can't even. Anyways, that resolution from 2011 does have energy usage and carbon emissions targets for not only the new buildings we're building, but for all the existing building stock. So really, Seattle has taken a very aggressive, you know, slant to their energy code, looking at the existing building provisions over the last couple of code cycles, you know, adding the substantial alterations provisions into there to really start to focus on all the existing buildings. And so we'll also talk at the end of the presentation about the Washington State Clean Buildings Act and also the Seattle Building, you know, Emissions Performance Act that are all targeting, you know, how we operate these buildings long term. So we're seeing a big shift from how we initially construct it to how we operate that building for the next 50 or 100 years. So with that, we'll pass it back to Andy.
Yeah, just a quick, Brian was commenting on this while we were kind of just chatting before the call started, but I mean, that's another trend that we're seeing too, is additional jurisdictions amending the state energy code similar to the way that Seattle's done it in the past. So in the 2018 code cycle, we saw that in Shoreline, Bellingham, unincorporated King County, Olympia was definitely evaluating and has conveyed a lot of interest in that. So that's a trend that we may expect to see more of in the future too. So we are going to be covering a lot of content here today. We try to distill things into kind of what are the highest, biggest impact items, but just know that there's so much under the surface that we're kind of glossing over or not getting into all the details on. And particularly today for the existing buildings, just lots and lots of nuance and gray area. So We're going to be presenting on just kind of the biggest ticket stuff. The other thing we want to make sure that's clear is Seattle's still in active development. There's been a lot of public meetings and input on proposals. Information presented here is based on the most current public draft on the SDCI website, but that hasn't gone through all of the final CCAB review, been approved by City Council. So everything here is just as of what we know today.
And then, as we've talked about, since the code is getting more complicated, the existing building sections are definitely getting more complicated. So early full team involvement, so you don't have that surprise when you're going in, when you get your permit review comments, or as a field inspection or whatnot. So early involvement of a full consultant team is becoming more and more important, just to understand what are those different triggers in existing buildings. So with that, we'll jump over to talking about the types of modifications that are covered in existing buildings and whatnot. So go ahead, Andy.
All right. Okay, getting into the kind of bulk of the presentation now. So there's generally a few different categories and important trigger points in existing building modifications. There's general repairs, there's alterations, there's additions where you're adding on or expanding a building, there's changes in space conditioning. That's a fairly significant trigger point in the energy code, as well as some changes to building occupancy. Something that's a little different between the state and Seattle. Seattle has a category called substantial alterations. And if you're all quaking in your boots at the sound of that, we'll talk a little bit more about why, if you've heard horror stories about substantial alterations or things like that. But want to prepare you with some information about things to be aware of as you go into projects so that you can avoid late in the game nasty surprises. Starting off, there's a section in the energy code around repairs that gives you a lot of room to do basic maintenance to your building. It's very low impact items like replacing the glass inside of an existing window, or repairing your roof, or doing small scale modifications to replacing light fixtures, things like that. So it's small maintenance items. Those are generally just okay to do those things. When you get into a little bit bigger projects, that's where a lot of projects land as alterations, right? So that's where you're doing just targeted modifications to a building within an existing building footprint. You are adding on or modifying an existing HVAC system. You are doing some minor changes to a building envelope, but not significantly changing the window quantity or size or things like that. We kind of always refer to it as you break it, you buy it. So it's kind of like the portions of the building that you're touching, all of those things that you touch need to get brought into compliance with current codes, but it doesn't ripple out and force you to bring other downstream things into compliance with the code. In general, there are some special conditions around that. There's a section around metering for existing buildings. Seattle expands that language. It's generally still not a huge trigger point, but there is some language in there for Seattle about if you are replacing all or substantially all of your electrical system, you may be triggering metering requirements. But it's, again, just kind of, you need to look at your building and your scope. And if there are areas that are gray or unclear, a common theme that you're going to hear during this session today is talk to your code official. Whenever there is gray areas or uncertainty, it's always best to get alignment early on and get everybody on the same page about what's required so that there's no unexpected surprises after you're just trying to get your permit and start construction.
And you can always comply with the new buildings provisions if you want, but most people want to just do the you break it, you buy it.
That's a good point, Eric. That's a good good clarification. So in general, if you're doing just system alterations, you're not going to be triggering compliance with like Section C411 and solar readiness or PV. You're not going to be triggering compliance with C406 credits. I mean, you do have to commission systems that you are touching. So if you are modifying HVAC systems, you have to go back and check your C408 thresholds. And if the scope and capacity of the systems that you are modifying triggers that commissioning threshold, you will need to commission those systems. So there's a lot of kind of back and forth and looking at thresholds. And another comment is what we see is it's pretty common once you're in there, if you're doing a fairly bigger alteration, a lot of times you may be, oh, we're going to connect this breezeway or we're going to bump out this area. It's pretty common to have a mix of now you've got an addition portion of your project as well as an alteration portion of your project. So thinking through where that boundary is, what's triggered for each of those sections, and then looking at the interface of that. Yeah, Brian.
Wondering about replacement in kind. So maybe thinking about the balcony repair right here. That didn't really get into envelope, but more wholesale envelope replacement. It might be triggered by, you know, mold remediation or whatever. It's pretty common to institute best practices, you know, going to a rain screen if there wasn't before, but are we going to get into triggering insulation upgrades, you know, adding exterior insulation to bring the wall section into modern code compliance? Do you have any, is it going to be a dollar threshold? Do you have any sense of that?
Yeah, we're going to come back to a little bit deeper dive on envelope in a few slides. So I'm going to put a pin in that and we're going to revisit that in a few minutes, Brian. That's a great question. Okay, so this alterations is what we're going to spend the bulk of the getting into a little bit more details per section. We're going to quickly buzz through some of these other modification types. So if you are expanding out your footprint, you are adding new area, that's a building addition. That is essentially new construction that needs to comply with all of the current energy code requirements. You do need to be a little careful about where that addition is interfacing to your building. Some things to think about is how are you going to tie that air barrier that's required for your addition into your existing building? You do have to air leakage test that addition, but not the existing alteration building. So that can get a little tricky in terms of, is there a clear wall that delineates that you can seal off to do your air leakage testing? Are you expanding out an open area for that addition? That gets a little tricky. Common theme today. Talk to your code official, get alignment on expectations there and what you can propose that is achievable for the project. A couple other kind of flexibility items of note. If you have a small addition under 1,000 square feet, you only have to get 50% of the C4062 efficiency credits for that addition. But other than that, you're essentially building new construction. It needs to comply with code. The next fairly significant trigger point in the energy code is if you have a change in space conditioning. So that is if you are increasing between thresholds of space conditioning categories in the code. If you have an unconditioned space and you are making it heated and or cooled, you have triggered a change in space conditioning and you essentially need to bring that space fully into compliance with the energy code. There's a little bit of flexibility given. You can either comply with a prescriptive envelope approach and they give you a 10% allowance on your component performance UA calculation, or you can get a 10% kind of flexibility on an energy model approach. But in general, if you are adding heating to an unconditioned space, or if you are adding cooling to a space that is currently heated but does not have cooling, if you add cooling to that space, you have now triggered a change in space conditioning and full compliance. There's a lot of terms that get kind of thrown around, but these are code defined space conditioning categories. So a low energy space is if you have under 1 watt a square foot. A semi-heated space is if you've got 1 to 2.3 watts per square foot, corresponds to 8 BTUs per square foot. And then anything over that is conditioned space. So for example, in parking garages, if you've got a water entry room that's 150 or 200 square feet, and you need to put in a 1 kW heater for freeze protection, that's over 2.3 watts a square foot. That's a conditioned space per code, even if it's just a small electric heater that is doing freeze protection at a low temp. That's a conditioned space per the energy code, per the defined terms. So that's just something that can be a little confusing or counterintuitive. Like freeze protection is not a code defined term or category. It's a little bit more of an informal way that we talk about spaces, but that's something that we see cause confusion.
And as we're evaluating existing buildings, we're looking for something, we're looking for mechanical systems that have been properly permitted, that are substantiated through real documentation. So if someone just installed something there and it wasn't permitted, then we get into this gray area that it hasn't, it may have been an unconditioned space, but it's being used as a conditioned space. So anyways, there are these gray areas that, we have required by the codes to do our due diligence to understand how they're conditioned and whether they were legally permitted or not. So.
All right, thanks, Eric. Next category is if you have a change in building occupancy, and not any change in building occupancy, but if you are converting from an FS or U occupancy category to anything else under the commercial codes, you now need to bring that space into compliance with the energy code. Same thing for if you're converting to or from group R dwelling units, same thing. You've triggered a change in occupancy usage that requires that space to be brought into compliance with codes. Seattle does have a specific exception for the FSU occupancy conversion. If you're converting something into a bakery, a commercial kitchen, a commercial laundry facility, if you do that as an all-electric project with Energy Star rated appliances and don't use any fossil fuel burning equipment or appliances for that conversion, that gives you a clear exception pathway as well. And that's just in Seattle. I don't believe that got pulled over to 2021 WSEC. All right, the big scary one, substantial alterations. Probably everybody has a little bit of a story about something where, this caught someone by surprise, right? So substantial alterations are specific to the city of Seattle. They're defined as if there's a damage ratio of 60% or more. There's also some language about if you are doing remodeling or additions that substantially extend the useful physical or economic life of the building, or if it's a reoccupancy of a building that's been substantially vacant. Those are all items that can trigger a substantial alteration for your project. A substantial alteration is essentially full compliance with the energy code as a new building. So that includes things like C406 credits. That includes things like, your envelope needs to generally be brought into compliance with the code. You do get a 15% allowance on that. Or you can get a 10% credit on an energy model approach. Interestingly, the latest draft of 2021 SEC has an added exception that you don't need to do your component performance UA calc with the C407 approach. So that is an avenue of flexibility to check out if you do have a project. Another clarification item, if you are upgrading mechanical systems to comply with the new heat pump requirements, that in itself does not necessarily trigger a substantial alteration. There's some specific language and clarifications added around that. There is also an impracticality clause. So within a substantial alteration, if there are things that are just impractical to do, bring those to your code official and ask questions about, hey, I can't do this thing, but here's something similar that we can do that is practical for the project. Or we can't do this, but here's another idea of something else that we can bring to the table. I think another key takeaway here is if you're working on a project and you think there's a chance that the project may be interpreted as triggering a substantial alteration, have that conversation with the city early and get clarity and alignment. I mean, that would just be kind of the really difficult thing to have happen is, you know, you're trying to submit for your permit and you get told, whoa, 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 this is a substantial alteration. And now that's a very significant change in scope and kind of has blown up your entire project, right? So whenever things are gray, whenever there's uncertainty, recommend talking to your code official, coming to the table, trying to get alignment early. And also, especially with these substantial alterations or projects where you have triggered significant upgrade requirements, ask those questions early about, hey, this thing just really isn't doable for the project, but here's some ideas about what is possible. Nathan, Eric, anything to add to that slide?
No, I think let's just keep moving on.
All right.
We can come back to it if we get some detailed questions on that.
So I wanted to put this slide like every other slide in this presentation because I think this is like literally the thesis statement of today's presentation is whenever things are gray or uncertain in your code interpretation, get clarity and just ask that question, make sure that everybody's on the same page and interpreting things the same way. You know, everybody's seen this McLeamy chart of kind of the earlier in the design process that you are making decisions or things like that. It's easier to incorporate, it's cheaper. You really don't want late in the game high impact surprises to pop up. So the sooner you talk to your code official, you're going to get more smiles like on the left than you know, no's on the right from the code official when you've just brought something way late in the game with you know, not bringing ideas or solutions to the table.
And I'd say that in Seattle in particular, they're much more amenable to if you say this particular code item is going to be a challenge. Here is how we would like to comply with the spirit of that requirement, maybe not the letter of it. That is, in my experience, more likely to get the stamp of approval than just straight up asking for a requirement to be waived because it's hard. They don't really like that line of argument. So it's like come into these meetings prepared and present a solution that they can sign off on, and avoid asking open-ended questions or yes, no things that you don't want to hear the no on.
Right. And there was a question in the Q&A of how does code define substantially extend the life of a building? Dwayne and the Lighting Design Lab did a session on existing buildings last week. The recording and all the slides are available on the website. We've got some links to some content from that here. Definitely recommend checking that out. But essentially, there is a group of people who kind of make those judgment calls. And so it is a very gray area. And so that's where you really want to be getting that input sooner than later, because it's not something that's got like a very explicit, clear definition on that. The thing that is a little bit more well-defined is that 60% damage ratio. There's a tip and then also there's a director's rule on how you calculate that 60% damage ratio. So that's another item worth checking out that's a little bit more clearly defined, but it is kind of fuzzy logic there, and that's part of what makes it really tricky and difficult.
And that's one of the reasons the substantial alteration provision hasn't really made it into the state code yet. You know, having 150 different cities and counties enforcing that and those trigger points is very different than the city of Seattle enforcing it. So, and then on historic buildings, I think we'll just, you know, there is a lot more flexibility from the code official to grant exceptions. So again, this is a negotiation. So again, start it early. So with that, Nathan, you want to talk? Are you talking about the envelope provisions?
Yeah, let's go into how what's going to be most impactful on the envelope for existing buildings, and it's all going to be, you know, very project specific. Rushing has been taken in the habit lately of really creating a matrix on all of our existing building jobs where we kind of break the project, as Andy indicated, apart into what portion is governed by the alteration language of the code versus the addition language versus maybe change in space conditioning language. So it's hard to give all the specifics you need for each of those silos, but generally speaking, there's kind of light touches you can do in many situations that do not even require you to bring a like wall, for example, all the way up into current energy code thermal performance. So first bullet point there, you can always replace the glass in a window if you preserve sash and frame without having to make that a modern window. So this is how you can, replace your single pane windows in a lot of buildings if they get cracked, things like that. Additionally, for the ability to add glazing, you are generally okay on most projects if you're adding a quantity of glazing that does not bring the whole building at the end of the project, not just the scope you're working on, but the whole building above those thresholds that the energy code establishes as sort of the allowable glazing percentage. In Washington State Energy Code, that's generally around 30% glazing. Seattle has much more specific glazing targets depending on what type of building you're at. So if you have an existing space and it's only 20% glazed and you want to punch a couple more windows and it's only going to bring it up the entire building up to 24% glazed, generally that's just allowed. You have to install contemporary performing windows under the current code targets, but you don't have to do anything more significant than that. However, if you want to really add a lot of glazing to a project, or is a building that was already fairly close to that key threshold and you're introducing more glazing, you can quickly trip into having to do more complicated analysis. If you suddenly find yourself, say, over 30% glazed on a Washington State Energy Code job, then you start having to look into trade-off calculations or maybe energy modeling to allow for that. It gets complicated quickly. You're probably going to be wanting to talk to your friendly energy consultant about it.
Yeah, thanks, Nate.
For roofs and walls, again, there's a little bit of flexibility for light touch type work. So in an alteration scope, if you expose the cavity of a wall, you were required to then backfill it with insulation that's basically performance equivalent of like a fiberglass bat before you close it up. But to Brian's earlier question, you wouldn't also have to add exterior insulation under like alterations scope work. However, when you get into those other categorizations that require full code compliance, like substantial alteration or changing conditioning, you would likely trigger the requirements to demonstrate that the whole envelope of the existing building performs at the same level as a new construction. And most likely you're talking envelope trade-offs there. And Andy kind of highlighted previously how depending on which code section you're under, there may be some allowances, like a 10% extra allowance on that envelope calculation, but not a huge ability to perform worse than a new construction envelope.
Yeah, and one other quick comment on that too is there is also some language on if you are doing an alteration or you can decide if you want to average that calculation for just this piece that you're touching, or you can do a whole building calculation. Probably that's going to be tricky if you've got an older building that does not have an envelope fully built to current codes. But I mean, that is an option if you do have maybe a newer building or something like that. You can kind of decide whether to show it as the whole building, including that portion, or just for that isolated portion. As Nate mentioned, it kind of does get really complicated really quickly, but there is some baked in flexibility. Brian, did we answer your previous question on this slide?
Let's see.
The provisions here are similar to past energy codes. There isn't a substantial change here, Andy.
Right. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you did answer my question. Yes. Okay.
And we can come back and talk more during the end Q&A if you think of something else. But
yep. Thank you.
All right. I'm going to kind of gloss through this one pretty quickly, but air leakage is something to consider. Additions, substantial alterations, you do need to do air barrier, you do need to do air leakage testing for those portions. This is again the like, think about if you've got an addition, where does that interface to the building? This is something where if you've got something special going on in your building, you're maybe expanding an open area, you might need to talk to your code official and get aligned on that game plan or what is or isn't feasible for your project. I'm going to kind of gloss through these because I overestimated how much extra time we were going to have in the session. Turns out we do still have a lot of content, but just a quick note here. In general, if you are doing additions, substantial alterations, you have triggered other requirements for that change in space conditioning or occupancy, you need to comply with C406. So same thing of make sure that you've got a clear game plan of what credits you actually can achieve for that space and how you're going to get to that area weighted target. Nate, do you want to touch this one really quickly?
Sure. Metering is a little bit different in the way that it's going to be applied to an existing building because it's less about, am I an alteration? Am I a substantial alteration? Am I an addition? And it's more about what are the capabilities of the building as it exists to accept metering information. So it's really mostly about, am I building on or changing a building that was constructed after the energy code already had metering requirements? And if so, whatever you alter, replace, add will likely have to be metered, with some exceptions. And then it's only more if you're we're going into an older building that has no metering already installed, no requirements when it was constructed, then you look at sort of the square footage triggers about, am I doing enough work in, say, an addition that I'm going to have to add a metering system to this building that doesn't already have it?
Thanks, Nate. All right, couple other items we're gonna buzz through because we do want to get into the heat pump upgrades. That's kind of a big substantial portion here. We talked about this in previous sessions, but just as a reminder, because this is gonna, potentially impact if you've got retail spaces and restaurants turning over in TIs. Seattle does have this new provision for electric ready commercial kitchens. So 2021 code beyond, if you are installing gas-fired appliances in a commercial kitchen, you do need to provide an electrical panel within or adjacent to that space at a kind of equivalent capacity. So something to be aware of for, restaurant TIs or things like that where you're turning over an existing building with a commercial kitchen. Quick recap on lighting. Lighting is another big item that does occur when we are renovating projects. The threshold has cranked down from 50% to 20% of fixtures. So if you are replacing luminaires, that's a new, more stringent threshold trigger point. There is some new language about if you are installing a new lighting system that does need to comply with controls. This is interior. This is also for exterior, and there were some clarifications on how those exterior lighting upgrade calculations and thresholds get set. So make sure to check out that section for 2021 WSEC. Nothing new here. This is same as 2018, but there are some additional kind of behind the ceiling trigger points around adding new wiring or circuits. Or relocating or adding new lighting control panels. And so that could be triggering requirements for you on lighting controls. So just something to be aware of. Can get a little tricky depending on your TI. So call your favorite lighting designer for your renovation project and make sure that you've got a code compliant design. All right, Eric, let's get into heat pumps.
So yeah, we are moving towards heat pumps. As we've talked about in the new building provisions, we're moving towards heat pumps being mandatory with backup of electric or gas. There are new provisions now in the state energy code that when you're replacing existing equipment like a rooftop package unit that has cooling in it, but it's a gas pack for heating, that needs to be replaced with an air source heat pump. So there are specific new tables in the code and new rules to follow on replacement of equipment, and it varies depending on whether that equipment had cooling or whether it's a heating only type of equipment. So some of those provisions still allow replacement with natural gas equipment. It just requires maybe a higher efficiency than the code baseline natural gas equipment. So there's new rules here. And, you know, every building is going to be a little bit different. So make sure to check out those new provisions and don't and coordinate that early on the project. Specifically with boiler replacements, if we move to the next slide, or no, excuse me, heat pump exceptions is where we're going. Is that where we wanted to go?
No,
Anyways.
I'm sorry. I double clicked on accident. Here we are. We want to talk about
boiler
boilers.
replacements. So if you're replacing, so again, we have different rules right now. And again, these rules may be altered slightly based on some of the revisions that may happen to either the state code. We'll just have to wait and see. And also with Seattle. But right now, essentially for space heating boilers, that table requires you to put in, you can still put in a natural gas boiler when you replace that, but it has to be a higher efficiency than the code minimum baseline, which is fairly easy to do. And then in Washington, you can replace service hot water, domestic hot water boilers with like for like still. Seattle has much more aggressive rules here and they're much more well developed than the one was in the 2018 code process. So in the 2018 code, there was a lot of public comment on the provisions, but again, we're looking to move towards a 50% heat pump system at a minimum, and then you can keep 50% of that existing or electric backup capacity when you're replacing boilers. So again, every building is going to be a little different in how that central heating hot water or domestic hot water system is set up. You know, there are a lot of considerations if you're going into a major replacement. You know, do you want to look at, since you're now putting more expensive heat pumps into the building, how do you do that? Where do you do that? You know, do you want to look at other things to upgrade to reduce those heating loads like energy recovery opportunities or energy recovery ventilation? So lots can go into those complicated projects with big buildings. The other provision for Seattle is air-cooled chillers are required to now be replaced with air-to-water heat pumps. So in buildings, there are some exceptions to that, but buildings that have both heating and cooling going on, we're looking to replace those air-cooled chillers with air-to-water heat pumps. And then there are just lots of exceptions to the base rules. As always, you can comply with the new code and fully kind of move that direction, but there are a list of exceptions, including, you know, connections to low carbon district energy systems or other things that may be exciting for what's going on in your neighborhood of existing buildings. So with that, let's talk about what you want to avoid. So City of Seattle is getting very specific about these emergency replacements of equipment. You know, it's not easy to, in a weekend, you know, rip out a natural gas boiler and put in a air source heat pump system. They do allow that replacement of that equipment in an emergency state. So if you can't get replacement parts for that old boiler, and you have to upgrade it to a new boiler, you can do that, but you're going to have to take out a bond and agree to, you know, upgrade the system over time. And right now, I think it's a 4-year window that's proposed, and you must submit a decarbonization plan. So that's a pretty detailed report. So again, planning up front if you have older aging natural gas equipment in your building or electric equipment in your building, you want to start to put together these decarbonization plans and get those in your capital budgets in coming years before this becomes a problem. So create a plan and understand how you're going to implement that. And so that brings us to the next slide, which is decarbonization plans. And so there is a very specific list of things that you need to do to fulfill a decarbonization plan. You're going to need to submit, one-line diagrams with equipment layouts and show, outline structural modifications that may need to occur, how you're going to comply with property line acoustics, or do you need a variance for your roof coverage or other things that you might need to do to put in air source heat pumps, or another type of technology that you want to use. So anyways, and things like a cost estimate as to what this is going to cost is all outlined in the Seattle code now for how you're going to transition that building off of fossil fuels or off of electric resistant heat. So,
and I think the key thing here is, okay, this is a new thing in code for this exception pathway, but this is really also kind of our lead-in slide to talking about clean buildings and building emissions performance standard, because that's why you see we've got this first bullet point here is like, think about doing one for your facility now in terms of this emergency boiler replacement where now you have to sign a bond for 4 years. That's not a place that you want to be in, right? Like where you've gotten backed into that corner, you don't really have options. Your boiler actually is at end of life and you do need that emergency replacement situation. If that's something that you can have capital planned for, you already have your plan in place, and do that before you get to that emergency replacement. That seems like something to work towards if it's feasible for your facility, or to recommend for your clients. And so that kind of tees us up to talk about clean buildings and building performance standards and what's happening kind of in the state and city of Seattle with that. Eric, do you want to tell us a little bit about the Clean Buildings Act?
So yeah, as we've been talking about, it's about how we operate that building for the next 50 to 100 years after we build it, and how do we meet our goals as a state so we don't have to go out and build a giant nuclear power plant or some other thing, right? So this is really, what is the cost to run a building in Washington State and how do we mitigate that long term? And so, the energy code can only do so much because with existing buildings. So we're moving over that starting in 2026, the state level, large buildings have to operate their building to what's called an energy usage intensity target. So this is all based on ASHRAE standard 100, and there are very specific rules that have been put in place, and there are penalties now for not operating your building at the acceptable energy usage rates. So this is based on energy at the state level under the Washington State Clean Buildings Act. And so, Andy, you want to, I know we're running short on time, so maybe we highlight that this is now getting expanded in tier 2 to multifamily buildings that are greater than 20,000 square feet. So again, this is continuing to expand and evolve in the state based on legislation that is passed. And then let's keep moving and hit the Seattle requirements here.
Sounds good. Just very briefly, so for the State Clean Buildings Act, Eric mentioned that energy usage intensity EUI target. So that is just a kind of kilobTUs per square foot per year target. There's also, for projects that just are not able to achieve those EUI targets, there are additional compliance paths, the primary alternate being the investment criteria path. That's essentially doing an energy audit and implementing cost-effective measures. So jumping over to Seattle has taken that clean buildings performance standard and is overlaying a new piece called the Seattle Building Emissions Performance Standard. You'll see it get abbreviated BEPS, BEPS. This is really back to that context piece. This is very much in support of that net zero carbon goal for the city. So this is around a 2050 target of net zero carbon emissions for Seattle's building stock. It is overlaid on the Clean Buildings Performance Standard, and that it's the same 5-year compliance cycle. It uses kind of the same intervals. It uses the same building square footage buckets, so to speak, of compliance. But what's different here is that instead of that EUI energy target, this is a greenhouse gas intensity target. So this is based on a carbon factor applied to the different fuel sources of your building type. So this is using SCL's low carbon emissions electricity factor, as well as a currently proposed long-term performance target based on the Clean Energy Transformation Act, CETA, long-term electricity, net zero operation targets. There's penalties for non-compliance. It goes into effect in 2027 with just the initial reporting and verification of data, and then starting with the greenhouse gas intensity metrics in 2031. There are penalties for non-compliance, similar to the Clean Buildings Act. Lot of detail on Seattle's website. They've got some really nice write-ups and documentations, depending on how much detail you want to get into, but a lot of really good resources on the website. We'll include some links. Here's just a little bit of a flow chart to kind of walk through. This is still in the rulemaking process. It did achieve a pretty significant milestone last week with the SEPA, the SEPA approval. So this is still ongoing. There's a number of rulemaking meetings that are ongoing, a lot of stakeholder engagement. And then again, that 2027 for reporting, 2031 for first cycle of emissions targets. There's also some exceptions in the first cycle for affordable housing. So that's something to be aware of, and multifamily phases in kind of a cycle behind. Here's just quickly a table of what those greenhouse gas intensity targets look like. You can go look up what the carbon factors are per fuel source to kind of estimate what that looks like in terms of your facility's usage. These are a little not very intuitive as just raw numbers, but if you are doing that sort of decarbonization plan for your facility, evaluating your current operation and kind of fuel mix against these targets is a good place to start. There are some additional alternate compliance options for the BEPS in its current draft form. The first compliance interval is going to have an alternative compliance payment option, ACP, where you can defer some portion of your greenhouse gas at a $190 per metric ton of CO2e. That's only for the first compliance cycle. So if you've got some capital plan where you're planning to install those system upgrades, you know, at X point at a future date, this might be an option to help you bridge that gap while you get your design and financing together, that sort of thing. You can also combine multiple buildings, do kind of an aggregate standard. You can propose an alternate greenhouse gas intensity target working with the city. There is also, I think the one other one worth highlighting here is this multifamily prescriptive option. So one pathway for a compliance cycle is if you are, for example, replacing your gas water heating system with a water heating heat pump system, that could demonstrate your compliance for that, that 5-year cycle. So really thought we were going to actually have more than 5 minutes for Q&A on this one, but here we are with 4 minutes left. Emily, would you mind pulling up our Q&A and let's see what we've got?
Yeah, thanks, Andy. It just means we had more good content to cover than we were anticipating. So thank you. The first question is air barrier testing required for remodeled facility? Excuse me, let me start over. Is air barrier testing required for a remodeled facility where adding a small addition is part of the remodel? If so, what is the WSEC code section?
So additions are nominally going to require both air barrier installation and air leakage testing. They basically have to comply with new construction requirements. That's in C502.3, which is the existing buildings addition section. And it specifically says the envelope has to comply with C402.1 through C402.5. C402.5 is where air leakage testing requirements are found. But again, to our point we made earlier, if you've got an addition going on to kind of being lumped onto a space that's in an existing building that isn't going to trigger requirements for air leakage testing and air barriers, maybe you're just doing alteration scope in that portion, it's a good topic to have with your code official in a pre-submittal meeting, because you might be able to present a case that's just not feasible to even section off your new addition in a way that you could test just the addition space.
Dwayne, I see you've got your hand up.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to add to the stuff you were just talking about, Andy, that before you do a big system replacement with heat pump, get some metering on it and find out what your actual peak loads really are. For space heating, you might have double the capacity you really needed. For water heating, it might be 10 times the capacity you really need based on old rules of thumb there. So you don't necessarily have to replace all of that capacity.
Yeah, thanks for chiming in on that, Dwayne. And Eric, we kind of sorry, we got a little behind and we went through this slide a little quicker than we meant to, but we did on this slide kind of mean to talk a little bit about yeah, again, as part of that, like a decarbonization plan is just a good idea. And part of that too can be, is there anything you want to strategically plan ahead for in terms of getting that meter data now while your building is in operation and before you're really getting too into the weeds of that design change? If you're go ahead, Eric.
Yeah, understanding where you'd want to feed that equipment from, and which electrical panels specifically, and getting that metering data is definitely an important step. And then looking at those, it takes time to put together a detailed heating load on a lot of these large buildings. Are there upgrades that are planned? And how does that system need to be sized, both from how it's typically operating and looking at that on your peak winter days, to how it has to be sized from a code standpoint, are all things that need to be evaluated for sure. So if you've done a plumbing, if you've done a low flow shower head replacement in a multifamily building over the years, that could have a substantial impact on the amount of domestic hot water you need to produce for the facility. So taking all that to account and making smart decisions, looking at things holistically, takes time and planning. And so it can definitely help to mitigate the cost of these capital improvements to the projects.
And thinking, I like that emphasis on thinking holistically, right? Because that was kind of one of the other things, is if you do have, say, a large building, is adding energy recovery something that can help you downsize X tons of expensive first capital cost heat pump equipment? Or thinking about what are the other opportunities to utilize other ECMs to make this improvement more cost effective, or not losing sight of kind of the whole entire building picture and getting too fixated on just that one system, thinking through all those different parts and pieces that feed into those loads. So
Okay.
we are, sorry,
Do we have time for one more, Andy, or we're going to need to wrap up?
Well, I was just going to say that I know that it's 1 o'clock. We're probably going to lose some folks to the next meeting of the day, but I think a few of us are happy to stick around and keep going with Q&A for any remaining items. So to folks that need to jump, thank you so much for joining us. We will be posting these slides and the recording of today's presentation. So stay tuned for that. Thanks for joining. And yeah, we're happy to stick around if there is another question.
I'll read the next question from the chat and we can go from there. If somebody else has a question, feel free to raise your hand. This next question is, how does the code define substantially extended life of building?
Oops. sorry, my mute button froze. We addressed that one while we were talking through the substantial alteration section. It's not a well-defined term. So that I would just really like to reflash this slide about 100 times. Communicate, talk to your code official, and ask that question early to avoid a late in the game surprise. Dwayne, you'll be very pleased to know that I didn't just like Photoshop your face onto this slide, but I really thought about it.
You're sweet.
I'm just kidding.
Substantially extends the physical or economic life of the building is the phrase.
And Seattle does have a tip on this, right? And so
Yeah,
there is
there is-
information about there, but definitely, you know, substantial alterations require a pre-submittal conference. It's definitely good to get that line of communication. If you think that you are potentially triggering this, talk to the city. So.
Yeah, and Dwayne, I'm not sure if you were on earlier. I gave a little plug for your LDL session, told folks to go check out that recording and slides. I mean, I think that the other important bullet point that you made then too was come with solutions, come with ideas, you know, bring a collaborative process to those projects. That's an important key to success.
Yep.
What other questions do we have?
Did we have any
So-
other questions in the chat, Emily?
We had one more from Melissa. So adding cooling alone is a trigger for full adding cooling alone is a trigger for full compliance for a space ? Does that make allowances for small cooling systems? Is a resiliency conference in a resiliency conference a few weeks ago hosted by the AIA, it was noted that adding cooling to spaces is becoming a health need as our air quality, especially in the summer here, is rapidly declining. I'm most thinking of smaller spaces like SF Resi and TI spaces.
And Nate, I saw you chimed in the chat. Do you want to kind of address this for the group?
Yeah, it is in the Seattle Energy Code language, or it was in the 2018 language. We haven't seen the final version of that section, but we're assuming it's going to carry forward as was phrased previously. Adding cooling to a space that was previously only heated would trigger full compliance for that space. It's not in the state code language. State code language is just based on what's your conditioning category before. Were you low energy, meaning more or less unconditioned or very minimally conditioned, and the increase in the capacity of heating or cooling above the thresholds, which is what Andy has on the slide.
Nathan, could I add to that? We
Mhm.
do have a 2,000 square foot threshold for that. So small space would be exempt. And as I think Andy mentioned earlier, there's if the only reason you're adding cooling is that you're converting to a heat pump system from a conventional heated system, then you probably do not have to comply with that.
Some great information. Thank you.
Thanks for chiming in on that, Dwayne. All right.
And that concludes the questions in our Q&A chat box.
Perfect. Well, I think we'll just pause there in case there's any last items. Do feel free to raise your hand or just jump in if there's anything else. Otherwise, we'll pause for just a moment and then wrap up.
I think you just
right.
did that well at explaining everything.
Oh yeah, sure. There's no more questions. Everybody's got it all under control. This is perfect.
Simple.
It's simple. That's right. All right. Well,
What does
thanks
my daughter
everyone
say?
for joining.
My daughter always says her teachers don't let them use the word easy in class, you know, so there's no such thing as easy. So don't use that term.
But can we say simple?
I don't know.
Okay.
It's not
It's probably in the
simple,
same
so.
category. All right. Well, thanks everyone for joining. We will be sending out slides and recording. Thanks again for joining us. Hope this was helpful.
Thank you.
Thanks all.